Looking for a fun bat cape for you to wear this Halloween? Well, today we're going to be making one. Hi, I'm Christina and I love to digitally apparel pattern creating unique pieces of wearable art. I also always really enjoy the theme of Halloween and that you can make some really fun different projects and fun little outfits. So I drafted this fun little girl a couple of days ago. I've been tweaking it a little bit and now I'm really excited to give her a test out and see how she turns out in real life. So let's get started. If you're interested in the pattern, you can find it in the link down below so that you can make your own bat cape. So let's get started. We're going to start by cutting out some bias strips to actually put the cording in. Now I only have some scraps from my pumpkin orange cape here, so I'm having to cut many more bias strips than I originally would like to do. So there's going to be a few more seams. I will be able to hide most of the seams, I think, in between the different seams because the seams are not that long either, but I'm going to make one long bias cording piece. Next, we're going to actually start cutting out all the pieces. So as I project, I want to make sure that the projector is all lined up properly. Then I'm going to move my pattern pieces down. I'm laying out tracing paper on the bottom, and then I'm putting my fabric on top of that, and then I'm going to put another piece of tracing paper on top of that. I do this because there is a lot of curves on this pattern and I want to be able to make sure that I'm not stretching a pattern too much or gathering a pattern too much. So I want to make sure that it easily can be seen exactly what I want to do. So I'm actually going to be marking out my seam allowances and marking out all my hash marks with these tracing papers. Now that I kind of have it laid out, I am going to do a little bit of Tetris to make my pattern pieces fit on my fabric and on my cutting board. I really need to get a little bit bigger cutting board, but it just takes a little bit of Tetris. Now you can see I am actually tracing out my pattern right onto my fabric. This really helps make sure that when I'm sewing, I will know that my cording and my two seams will all match up beautifully. Sometimes when you're sewing cording, it likes to mess with stuff. So especially when I'm using cording, I love to give myself my stitch lines. Once I have my stitch lines traced out, I am just going to go ahead and cut out on my cut line. So I don't actually trace out my stitch line and my cut line. I am just tracing out my stitch line. And then I did let my fabric shift a little bit because I didn't weight it down. Learn from my mistake. And weight your fabric down so that it doesn't move on you while you're cutting it out. And then I'm just cutting it out on that cut line. Now remember, you need 4 pieces of each of the pieces. I have laid out on my pattern board here so that I have a total of 2 pieces of each, and I'm cutting on the double. So I have 2 pieces of fabric with the right side of the fabric facing in. That's why I have tracing paper on the bottom and the top, so that I only need to cut out the pieces twice for the front and the back of the cape. Next, we're going to move on to the bias tape. So all those bias pieces that I cut, I am going to sew together. So you want to line up your edges and you want to make sure that the 45-degree angles for each of the seams is facing away from each other. You can see here that the points are facing away from each other. Then you're going to sew across those points, and then when you actually iron them open, you will have a straight line. This is essential to make sure that you are working very hard to line those up and everything. Then we're going to want to go and press all of those seams open. That way you don't have any bulkiness in there. Some of these seams will end up part of my cording on the different seams. So I want to make sure they're as flat and as crisp as possible. Then I'm going to move back to my sewing machine, and now I'm going to insert the cording into the bias strip that I've created. So I'm just going to fold the bias tape around, put that cording in, just leaving a little bit out so that I can make sure I can see it and make sure it's going with it. Then I'm going to use a zipper foot. Make sure you backstitch at the beginning, and you want to sew as close as possible to that cording piece. That's why you want to use that zipper foot. So I'm just going to stitch all the way down. I have like 8 yards, I think 9 yards of cording here that I'm going to just sew and sew and sew, and you just want to make sure you can be as close as possible to that cording. Now it's actually time to start putting the cape together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just grab my first piece here and my cording. And I'm going to start pinning my cording on the stitch line as close to the cording as possible to the stitch line I have marked out with my tracing paper. This ensures that I'm getting the cording right up next to that seam so that'll make a beautiful crisp line. So I'm just going to work my way from the top to the bottom, and I'm only doing the one piece you can see here. That is because I want to make sure it is lined up beautifully. Now, there's a few different options that you can go from here. Before you actually put the other piece on, depending on how you feel about your sewing skills, you can do a seam right now. So I'm just going to cut my cording off. It's now pinned to my one seam. If I feel super confident, I can continue the way what I'm doing is now I am pinning stitch line to stitch line. So I'm lining up the very corner, stitch line to stitch line. So I'm looking at both sides of my pattern as I am pinning it. And I'm pinning everything together. Now, if you did not feel quite as confident to make sure everything looks beautiful in one go, it is a really good idea to sew your cording to one side of the pattern piece and not have to be dealing with the cording and 2 pattern pieces at the same time. So just kind of know that if you want to try it all in one go, you can do it. I definitely messed up a few times and my bottom kind of got pulled up and I had to seam rip. But for the most part, I felt very confident in sewing the 2 pieces and the cording all at once. I also, as you can see, use tons and tons of pins. I always find when you're doing cording, when you're trying to get as close as possible, you can use a lot of pins to make sure that everything's laying exactly where you want to, and then you're not fussing with it when you're actually going under the needle and in the thick of the moment. So I use tons of pins, and with cording, I always recommend using tons of pins. And then I have my 2 pieces. Here we go. I'm going to just do a quick check. Looks good. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to maybe throw in a couple more pins just to make sure that I am good. Now I do prep all of the pieces at once. So I just showed you me prepping one. I will prep them in doubles so that I am prepping all of the pieces, and then I'm going to move over to my sewing machine and I'm going to use my zipper foot. And again, I'm going to be sewing as close as I can to that cording while still staying on that stitch line. And I'm just going to sew a little bit at a time, pulling out my needles and pulling out my pins as I go so that it looks beautiful. And then I'm going to backstitch at the end. There we go. Looks good. There we are. Then I'm going to move on to my next set that I have prepped. So like I said, I have prepped all of them. This is kind of like batching stuff, so I pin all of them together. Then I move over to my sewing machine and I sew them all as they can get. So it goes a little bit faster because I'm not doing one task and then moving over to the sewing machine and completing that next task. I am doing as many tasks as that one, like pinning, for example, until I either A, run out of pins or run out of patterns. Then I'm going to move over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew everything I can together. There we go. She looks good. Ooh, I love how this is already coming together. Now it's time to move over to the ironing board. So I'm going to clip all of my curves as I go down each one of the pieces. This will let it relax to where it needs to go. And then I'm going to flip it open and I'm going to iron down the one side. Now you can go and iron down both sides. You can try to do the press open. Because you have that cording in there, it's always going to be a little bit more difficult to work with. So I will often only I will clip it and then just pin it on the one side. So you want to make sure you get some nice sharp scissors so you can clip all the way to that stitch line. Make sure you do not cut through that stitch line. If you accidentally cut through that stitch line, you will have to go back in. You will have to try to go around that little blip that you did. So it is essential that you cut to and not through that stitch line. Once I have everything clipped and ironed, now I'm going to start sewing the pieces together. So I have multiple pieces together that just have the one bit of cording in between. Now I'm going to be taking each side and I'm going to be sewing them together again. So because I'm working with the cording again, I'm going to start by pinning as many times as I can. So I'm going to go from having 8 pieces to now I'm going to have 4 pieces, because I'm going to have 4 on one side, 4 on the other side, and then 4 on the front side and 4 on the front side. So same concept, I am pinning my cording to my stitch line, and then I'm taking the pattern that matches up with it and I'm pinning that pattern piece to my stitch line. Again, if you don't feel confident, or if you tried to do it the first time around and you caught yourself a lot, you were never quite on the stitch line, then I would recommend pinning the cording to one of the pattern pieces, sewing it on, and then pinning your other pattern piece on it. Because I am working with a satin, everything is a little bit slippery and it can move and change positions on you. So that is another way to do this. I just love using tons of pins to make sure I am sewing stitch line to stitch line. And as you are starting to get really close into this end here, you can see I have a ton of the cording just causing lots and lots of bulk. So I'm actually going to cut some of that cording away. So to cut the cording away, I'm going to pull the cording out of the casing and then clip that cording off and then pull that casing back over. So you want to make sure that when you are pulling that cording out, you're pulling past where your stitch line would be, so that when you pull that cording casing back over it, the cording stops before the seam allowance will. If you do not go quite so far, it is hard to reach back in there and pull the cording again to give it a clip. So I always cut a little bit more out than I probably need to, mostly because I want the seams, and these are going to be corners that I'm working with right here. So I want them to be them to be as little bulk as possible. So I maybe cut a little bit too much cord out, but because of how much is going to be going into this point, I would rather have it be something that I can kind of press and make look really crisp at the end than have the cording go all the way up to that corner. And then as I finish, I'm just going to continue to pin everything in. Yeah, look at how good that's looking. Ooh! Now we're going to move back over to the sewing machine and we're going to do these stitches again. I'm going to be sewing as close to the cording and right on top of those stitch lines as possible, and I'm going to be pulling out my pins as I go. So right at the beginning of this pattern piece, I did notice that I was sewing a little tuck into my seam. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a small seam rip right up at the top here, and I'm going to repin it, make sure it's nice and crisp, and re-sew over that part. So you want to make sure that if you do catch any of those mistakes, that you just quickly seam rip them open and redo them so that your bat wings looks amazing. Once we have them together, we're going to move back over to the ironing board, and we're going to start clipping again so that we can let those curves relax and sit right where they need to. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to put an iron on so that we are pressing those seams to one side. I am loving how this is turning out. I do have a few little easing wrinkles in here. I'm hoping when I clip everything that will help work it out. I may actually also trim out some of those extra seam allowance to really help that curve relax down. But I am loving the contrast of the black and orange piping. Now that I have it all ironed and pressed, it is time to sew the center back seam. So on one of the center back seams, I actually only want to sew to the bottom of my hash marks from the top down and from my hash mark to the point. I want to do this because then I actually have a place to flip my bat wings right side out that is on a straight of grain and will not stretch and will not cause me other problems. There's many places where you could flip your bat wings because I'm going to do a full bag out of these bat wings. There are other places that you could do this. I always find if you can do it in the most inconspicuous place, that is on a straight of grain. So the bat wing that will always be facing my back, always be touching my back, I can hand slip stitch that together and nobody will be the wiser that that is a hand stitch there instead of a machine stitch. Then on the other one, I'm going to sew from top to point. So it's going to be one that has the full seam sewn and one that only has a little bit at the top and a little bit at the bottom. Once I have everything pinned, I am then going to move over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew right on my stitch line. So I'm going to back stitch right there at the bottom, sew up to my mark. I'm going to back stitch there, then I'm going to move up to my hash marks at the top and then back stitch, sew up to the top and back stitch again. This way I actually have that opening that will flip my back cape to the right side out. Then on the other one, I'm just going to sew from hem to point. Then we're going to move back over to the ironing board and we're going to press open the seams. This fabric is getting very hairy and getting everywhere on me. And it's definitely kind of fraying out, but that's okay. So I'm going to press open one, and then the one that I have the opening on, I am still going to press open those back so I have a nice crisp line on either side to be working with. So I want to make sure that I'm ironing back on that stitch line as best I can. Get down to that point. There we have that opening. Next, it is time to sew the front of the bat wings to the back of the bat wings. So I just pick a point around my bat wings and I start pinning. So you want to match up the points, you want to match up the, well, they're all points, I guess, and the center and the seams, but almost all the seams end in points. So you just want to go through and match everything up. I pin again like crazy. If you did not quite get your cording all the way out or cut back quite enough, this is a time where you can still try to finesse that a little bit. The other thing that I also did when I was working with specifically the point where I have 3 cording points all coming in at once, I went in and I trimmed down my seam allowance. I trimmed down the cording stuff just because I want to get as much bulk out of there so that it can lay really nice. It can be a crisp line. So wherever you feel like the bulk needs to get out, definitely trim it away carefully. You don't want to accidentally cut something that you don't want to cut. You don't want to cut through a stitch line that you would then have to go back and redo. So make sure you do that carefully. But here I am just trimming away because right now I have 6 pieces of cording coming into this point right here. So I'm trimming everything away that I can so that when I flip it right side out, it won't be a super bulky mess. And make sure that you pin on the right side all the way around. I started pinning, I got most of the way around, I flipped around, and I started pinning on the opposite side. So just double check before you move to your sewing machine that you actually pinned all the way around on the same side. And I ran out of bobbin, so we're going to go ahead and replace that bobbin, and then we're gonna sew again. So we're gonna start back at that beginning, put it down, and we're just gonna sew all the way around. So at the points, I always like to backstitch because I'm going to be clipping those away, and it always helps to give me a little bit more thread there to help really secure it. Now down at these points, I realized I patterned them a little bit too small. So when you get to points like that, I always recommend doing at least 1 stitch. That one was so tiny, I actually did 3 stitches. So you want to go down, 1 over, or 3 over, and then back up. And then you will be able to hit that, make that look much more like a point than if you were to just go into the point. Because you have to think, you still have all that fabric sitting on the inside of your garment. So whenever I do points, I like to go down, over at least 1, and then back up. Just something to take, or just something to consider. And we're going to trim a little bit more of this excess away so that it's not in my way. And I get some of the bulkiness out of there. Missed that while I was originally pinning. And here we go, the other side. Now I did 3 on the other side, so I want to do 3 on this side as well so that they match. There we go. Almost there to that bulkiest point. I'm going to go a little bit further. And we are around. So now it's time to trim everything away. So I'm going to take my pinking shears and I'm going to trim all the way around. I specifically decided to use my pinking shears because of how much this fabric was fraying. And if I can help in any way, I definitely want to do that. So this is just kind of a slow process where you are going to be pinking all the way around on all the seams. And you can see I'm definitely generating a little bit of a pile of extra bits. Then you also want to make sure that you are cutting nice and close to all of those points. So you don't just want, you still want to clip really close to those points. Make sure you don't clip through them. Now it's time to flip everything to the right side out. So I like to try to get as far into those points as I can, pull them out with my finger, and then I continue working them to a point with my point turner. Now there are some tricks you can do using a needle and thread to really help pull it out, using a safety pin to get it out. I did not prep any of those. I was not thinking, and I was too excited to see the cape turn to the right side out, so I just started flipping not thinking about it, which then caused me to actually work a little bit harder to get it all flipped out. But that's okay. It turned out really great. So it's just a slow process of turning all of those corners out and getting them as pointed as possible. Now that I have it turned fully out, it is time to give it an iron. So I'm going to be working to all those points and crisping up all of the seams with just a little, since it is a satin, with just a little bit of rolling of my fingers, I am able to get the seam to kind of pop out. I want to get these as crisp as possible so that the end look looks beautiful. And as I'm working around, I am just throwing a few presses up next to my bindings to really get everything to be laying the way I want it to be. I am definitely loving how this bat wing cape is turning out. I am so excited to wear it. Once I have the pressing done, it is time to add the elastic. So I'm going to add the elastic I'm going to add my shoulder elastic up at the main points where all three cordings are coming together. And then working down the arm, I'm going to pin on my elastic at my points. I always recommend checking the elastic for yourself, the elastic placement for yourself, because everybody is a little bit different. So you're going to want to make sure that the elastic placements will work for you. So always double check before you actually sew them on. But once I have them pinned on, I'm going to move over to my sewing machine and I'm going to zigzag stitch them on. On to the second one. Zigzag back stitch at the top, down over the other one, and zigzag stitch or back stitch at the bottom. Make sure it is nice and secure. And the last one, this one, there's a lot of bulk here, so this one was definitely the most cranky to get it to zigzag and everything. But I got them all on. Once you have all of your elastic on, it is time to give it a test try on. If you're happy with everything, then the final step is to actually hand sew the center back opening closed. So I'm just going to have my needle and thread. I'm going to pop those two seams up and away from the other seam so I'm not accidentally catching something on the other side. And you can do a couple different stitches. You could do a whip stitch around since it won't ever be seen, or you can do a slip stitch through the two. I'm too excited and I really want to put this on, so I'm going for the easy whip stitch around. And we tie it off. Look at how beautiful that looks. And for the final result, here it is. Woo! I am so happy with how this bat cape turned out. I think she turned out really cute, and it is really fun to just wear around the house. So if you want to make this pattern, don't forget you can find the link to the pattern in the description below. And if you also enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. That way you can continue to see fun ways to digitally pattern stuff and make it and create some amazing pieces of wearable art, or even some more Halloween costumey things. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy patterning and sewing!